In the world of American true crime, some stories are so dark they become permanent fixtures in our minds. They're more than just cases, they're modern legends, cautionary tales whispered in the dark. But few are as haunting, as graphically violent, and as maddeningly unsolved as the case of the Black Dahlia. This isn't just a story about a murder, it's the story of a city gripped by terror, an investigation that spun out of control, and a killer whose methods pointed to a terrifying and specific skill set. A skill set that have made him easy to find. So how did a killer with the steady, methodical hands of a surgeon disappear without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a bisected body and a permanent scar on the face of Los Angeles? January 15, 1947. A mother is walking with her young child through Leimert Park, a quiet, undeveloped part of Los Angeles. In a vacant lot, just feet from the sidewalk, she sees something that makes her stop. At first, she thinks it's a discarded mannequin, broken at the waist, but as she gets closer, the horrific reality dawns on her. It's not a mannequin. It is the body of a young woman, posed with a deliberate, chilling grotesqueness. Her body has been sliced cleanly in half. Her mouth has been carved into a ghastly, permanent grin, stretching from ear to ear. And maybe the most unnerving part, the scene is clean. There isn't a single drop of blood on the grass or on the body, which had been scrubbed and washed before being dumped. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a statement. It was a performance. And it was the opening act of one of the most intense, sensationalized, and ultimately frustrating manhunts in American history. Before the macabre moniker, before the screaming headlines, she was just Elizabeth Short. Born in Boston on July 29, 1924, she was one of 5 daughters. Her early life was shaped by the instability of the Great Depression. After losing his business in the stock market crash, her father parked his car on a bridge and vanished. The family assumed he'd taken his own life, but years later, he resurfaced, writing a letter from California to say he'd just started a new life. This early trauma seemed to set a pattern for Elizabeth's life, a constant search for something stable that was always just out of reach. Her friends called her Betty. She was beautiful, with pale blue eyes and striking jet black hair, which she often adorned with flowers. She was movie-struck, another young woman drawn to the West Coast by the dream of Hollywood stardom. The reality of her life, though, was far from glamorous. She suffered from severe asthma and bronchitis, which required lung surgery. Looking for a better climate, she drifted between Florida and Massachusetts before finally heading to California in 1942, to live with the father who had abandoned her. That didn't last long. After they argued, she left and began the transient life that would define her final years. She took odd jobs, mostly as a waitress, living in cheap hotels and cramped apartments, and staying with a string of men who drifted in and out of her life. The story the press would later paint, that of a reckless party girl, was a sensationalized caricature. Those who knew her described a young woman who was often broke and secretive, but not the femme fatale from the papers. She did find love once, with an Army Air Force pilot named Major Matthew Michael Gordon, Jr. He even proposed in a letter from overseas, but tragedy struck again. He was killed in a plane crash in India in 1945, just days before the war ended, extinguishing her one real chance at a happy life. In the last 6 months of her life, she was back in Southern California, mostly around Los Angeles. It was during this time that she got her famous nickname. Patrons at a soda shop in Long Beach started calling her the Black Dahlia, a playful nod to the popular film noir, The Blue Dahlia, and her preference for black clothing and the flowers she wore in her hair. She was a woman chasing a dream, adrift in the sprawling, unforgiving city. On January 9, 1947, she returned to Los Angeles. It was the last time anyone could say for sure they saw her alive. 6 days later, her body would be discovered, and Elizabeth Short the person would be lost forever, replaced by the tragic myth of the Black Dahlia. When the call came into the Los Angeles Police Department that cold Wednesday morning, It sent a shockwave through the department. The first officers on the scene in Leimert Park found something that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The body was displayed, posed. Her arms were raised over her head, and her legs were spread apart. But it was the sheer brutality, carried out with such an unnerving calmness, that was so shocking. Her body had been expertly cut in half at the waist, a technique known as a hemicorporectomy. The cut was clean, precise, suggesting it was done by someone with anatomical or surgical knowledge. This wasn't the work of some frenzied attacker. This was the work of someone with a steady hand and a sharp knife. The mutilations didn't stop there. Her face was disfigured by what's called a Glasgow smile, which is a cut that stretched from the corners of her mouth all the way toward her ears. There were other cuts across her body, and pieces of flesh had actually been carved from her thigh and breast. The coroner later determined she had been bound at the wrists and ankles and, honestly, likely tortured for hours, maybe even days before she died. The official cause of death was from repeated blows to the head and shock from her injuries. But, the most baffling thing for investigators was the complete lack of blood at the scene. The body had been drained of all blood elsewhere, scrubbed clean, and then carefully transported and posed for discovery. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was a stage. It was a message of contempt and power aimed directly at the city of Los Angeles. The message was clear: there was a monster loose, someone who wasn't just a killer, but a skilled technician of butchery. From the very beginning, the LAPD knew they were hunting for someone who likely wore a uniform of expertise in their daily life. Maybe a doctor, a surgeon, or even a mortician. The discovery of Elizabeth Short's body kicked off one of the largest investigations in LAPD history. The sheer depravity of the crime demanded a massive response, with hundreds of officers assigned to the case. Public terror was mounting and the pressure was really on. The first challenge was identifying the victim. With no computerized databases, it was a huge task. Her fingerprints were carefully taken, and in a brilliant move for the time, a staffer at the Los Angeles Examiner suggested using their new sound photo machine, basically a primitive fax, to send the prints to the FBI in Washington, D.C. And, you know what? It worked. Just 56 minutes later, the FBI had a match. Elizabeth Short's prints were on file from a 1943 job application at an Army base and an arrest for underage drinking that same year. With a name, the investigation could finally begin. Detectives frantically tried to piece together her final days, the so-called missing week. They knew she'd returned to Los Angeles from San Diego on January 9th, dropped off at the Biltmore Hotel by Robert Red Manley, a married salesman she'd been dating. Manley said she was there to meet her sister. Hotel employees remembered seeing a woman matching her description, making phone calls and looking increasingly agitated before she left around 10 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting. Manley became the first major suspect, but after intense questioning and polygraph tests, his alibi held up and he was cleared. The investigation fanned out. The autopsy report strengthened the theory of a killer with medical training, leading police to question students and staff at the nearby USC Medical School. But that went nowhere. They interviewed around 75 men from an address book she'd left behind, but they were all dead ends. Elizabeth's transient life meant she left a faint trail. She bounced between cheap apartments and friends' homes, making it nearly impossible to build a clear timeline. The case was already becoming a labyrinth. While the LAPD scrambled for a lead, the case exploded in the press. For the hyper-competitive newspapers of 1940s Los Angeles, this murder was circulation gold. The gruesome details and mysterious victim created a media frenzy. It was the press that gave her the nickname the Black Dahlia, a name that was both glamorous and sinister, forever tying her to Hollywood's dark, noir mythology. The coverage was relentless and, honestly, often unethical. Reporters swarmed the crime scene, trampling evidence. They practically set up shop at police headquarters, sometimes answering tip lines themselves and hiding information from detectives for their own exclusive scoops. In one of the most infamous examples, reporters from the Los Angeles Examiner called Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Short, pretending her daughter had won a beauty contest. They coaxed personal details and family photos out of her before cruelly revealing that Elizabeth had been murdered. Then they flew her to Los Angeles, hiding her from the police and rival papers to protect their story. This sensationalism was a disaster for the investigation. Rumors and lies were printed as fact, sending police on countless wild goose chases. Elizabeth was painted as a promiscuous tease who asked for trouble, a narrative that sold papers but had little to do with the truth. This hysteria also created a bizarre sideshow, a flood of false confessions. Over 60 people confessed to being the Black Dahlia killer. Each one, no matter how unbelievable, had to be checked out, draining time and resources from an already overwhelmed police force. The media had turned Elizabeth Short's murder into a public spectacle, and in doing so, they may have helped her killer escape justice. While dozens of fantasists were confessing, the real killer decided to join the conversation. On January 24, 1947, 9 days after the body was found, a package arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner. The address was made of words cut and pasted from newspapers. On the envelope, another pasted message read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings letter to follow." Inside was a collection of Elizabeth Short's personal effects, her birth certificate, social security card, photos, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. One page had been torn out, sparking the immediate suspicion that the killer's name was on that page. Every item had been carefully wiped clean with gasoline to erase fingerprints. This wasn't a panicked move, it was psychological warfare. The killer was showing off his control and his contempt for the police. He was proving he had been with Elizabeth and was now playing a game. The package confirmed the killer was not just a brute but a cunning and arrogant person who was following the case and honestly enjoying the chaos. As promised, more letters followed. One, made of more pasted clippings, read, "Have changed my mind, you would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." Another handwritten note taunted, "Had my fun at police, Black Dahlia Avenger." The killer wasn't just content with committing one of the most gruesome murders in the city's history. He wanted to be the author of his own dark story, all while remaining a terrifying phantom. The investigation had become a public spectacle with a killer who loved to play games. If you're finding this dive into one of America's most chilling cold cases compelling, make sure to subscribe for more historical crime analysis. Now let's look at the men who fell under the shadow of suspicion. As the killer's taunts made headlines, the LAPD investigation zeroed in on a growing list of over 150 suspects. But a few names rose to the top. Men whose lives or professions placed them squarely in the frame. First up was Mark Hansen. A wealthy nightclub owner, his name was literally handed to the press by the killer on the cover of that address book. The connection was immediate. Elizabeth Short had known Hansen and had even stayed at his home for a while. Hansen admitted he'd made a pass at her and she'd rejected him, giving him a potential motive, the rage of a spurned man. Police investigated him thoroughly, even bugging his house, but came up with nothing. Though he was cleared, the theory that he was involved, maybe hiring someone to do the job, has never fully gone away. A more mysterious suspect was Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and former mortician's assistant, a detail that, really caught the attention of investigators. Dillon wrote to a police psychiatrist on the case, showing a disturbing amount of knowledge about the murder that hadn't been made public. He claimed a friend told him the details, but police suspected Dillon himself was the source. For a time, he was their best lead. But the case against him was purely circumstantial, and after some pretty intense questioning, he was let go. But of all the suspects, none is as compelling as Dr. George Hodel. He was a brilliant physician who ran a clinic in Los Angeles, but, Hodel definitely had a dark side. He was known for his wild parties and, most importantly, he had the one skill police were looking for from day one. He was a surgeon. Hodel became a suspect in 1949 after his own daughter, Tamar, accused him of sexual assault. Though he was acquitted, the trial put him on the Dahlia investigators' radar. In 1950, the district attorney's office bugged his home. The wiretap transcripts are honestly just chilling. Hodel was heard talking about payoffs to police and illegal abortions. Most damning of all, on one recording he was heard saying to an unknown visitor, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." It was the closest thing to a confession police ever got. It was a stunning admission from a prime suspect with the skills and opportunity to have committed the crime. Yet shortly after, the investigation was shut down. No charges were ever filed. George Hodel left the country and lived abroad for decades. The case against him has since been championed by his own son, Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD detective who is convinced of his father's guilt. However, critics argue the case remains circumstantial, built on interpretation rather than hard proof. Despite the massive investigation, the media frenzy, the taunting letters, and a list of compelling suspects, the case hit a wall. One by one, the leads evaporated. Robert Manley was cleared. Mark Hansen's alibi held up. The case against Leslie Dillon fell apart. And George Hodel, the suspect who seemed to fit the profile perfectly, was allowed to slip away. By the early 1950s, the manhunt had lost its steam. The headlines moved on. The investigators were reassigned to other cases. The Black Dahlia case was never officially closed, but it went cold. The files grew thicker with interviews and dead-end leads, but the central mystery remained. The police were up against a killer who was both brazen and meticulous. He craved attention but was forensically disciplined, leaving no usable fingerprints and no definitive crime scene. The science of the 1940s was no match for a killer this cunning. The case became a symbol of failure, a frantic hunt that simply ran out of road, leaving only the chilling silence of an unsolved crime. The murder of Elizabeth Short is more than just America's most famous cold case. It's a dark mirror reflecting the time, the glamour and corruption of post-war Hollywood, the reckless power of the press, and the terrifying fact that even a crime this shocking can go unpunished. The most haunting part of the case, the detail that makes it a true horror story, is the killer's signature. The bisected body, the drained blood, the surgical precision, it all pointed to a man with a unique and terrifying knowledge of the human body. That clinical brutality is what so baffled police. How could a man with such a specific, identifiable skill set, a doctor, a surgeon, commit a crime that horrified the world and then just melt back into society? How could he vanish, leaving behind a legacy defined not by his capture but by his chilling, methodical work? The story of the Black Dahlia has no final chapter. It ends right where it began, with the image of a broken body in a vacant lot and a silent, lingering question that has echoed through the decades, a question that may never be answered. The Black Dahlia case remains a scar on the history of Los Angeles, a story with no final chapter. Who do you think is the most likely suspect? Share your theories in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most compelling mysteries.